My name is George. I'm the programs manager here at the History Center of Lake Forest Lake Bluff, and I'm very excited to see such a full crowd this evening. We're very excited for you all to be here, returning members, returning attendees, new residents, everyone. So everyone's welcome, and we're very happy to see you all tonight. So we've got a very exciting program for you all. Today we're featuring Architectural Lake Forest with author Art Miller and in collaboration with Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. I would like to pass it over to the Executive Director of Lake Forest Preservation Foundation for a few remarks, Marcy Kerr.
I'm George Seller, Marcy Kerr, the Executive Director at the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, and I want to thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many new friends and old faces, and it's just great. And there's a couple of people that I wanted to acknowledge. First of all, Art Miller, who his vision, knowledge, and passion made this project for this book happen. Without him, it wouldn't have. We're so grateful. We also had a great team who consisted of Adrian Fawcett, David Robson, and Marcus Norman. They were great to work with, very professional and really dedicated to the project. I also wanted to thank, we had 2 or 3 great sponsors, but here tonight I wanted to thank Baker McNicholas Group, Lori Baker, Alyssa McNichols, and Peter Coutant. The maps that, those of you who had the book, the maps that were included in the books were not originally in our plan, and as we got moving along on it, we're like, let's put some maps in it. But they were expensive to do, and we went out and we asked the Baker McNicholas Group if they would sponsor it, and they just jumped in and we're so grateful for their sponsorship. I wanted to introduce Lori Baker, who's in the back there. Lori, thank you. She's been very supportive, her and her daughter, Alyssa, longtime residents and supporters of Lake Forest, so we really appreciate it. And then, of course, I want to thank the History Center, who invited us to collaborate on this program in this beautiful space to learn more about the history of Lake Forest and also the architecture of Lake Forest. So, and also I just wanted to plug for our book. It is for sale in the back. When you're leaving, if you don't have a copy, it's really a great copy, over 260 photos in it, maps of all the neighborhoods, etc. So we hope that you'll pick up a copy. Arthur H. Miller, a half-century Lake Forest resident, that's amazing, is an archivist and a librarian for special collections at the Lake Forest College. He's a co-author, co-editor, and author of many books and articles on Lake Forest history, architecture, and landscape architecture. Across the last 3 decades, he has given many local tours to groups ranging from 3rd graders to the Yale School of Architecture and the Cultural Landscape Foundation. He has lectured on Lake Forest both locally and in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. He's the past 2-time president of the Lake Forest Foundation. He currently serves as an honorary director. And I think anyone that knows Art could say he's just amazing. The knowledge just flows out of him. And we're so proud to have him in our community and so proud for all he does for the Preservation Foundation, the History Center, and the garden clubs and everything else. So thank you, Art. And I'll turn it over to you with that.
Well, thank you very much for that. My wife, Janet, in the first row will attest to the fact that my memory is not perfect, especially when I go to the grocery store. But I'm delighted you're all here. Very pleased to see all these good friends and new friends. Thank you for all coming out on this typical February evening. So I'll move right along. This talk is going to be an overview of the new book with some of the architect's clients mentioned and injected into the for historical depth. But basically it's covering 261 new photographs in spring and summer, taken in the spring and summer of 2022 by local intrepid photographer Marcus Norman. Now, he did a lot of these on a bicycle. I had to go out sometimes and find some of the more obscure West Side things with him, but he found a lot of these on his own. He took over 400 photographs altogether, and it just boils down here to 261. 7 drawings were done by artist Alice Moulton Ely, who is also a former president of the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation from the 1980s. These are into the 2000s. The book's producer, Adrienne Fawcett, I'm not sure if she's here tonight or not, but she's an extraordinary magical worker with things. And David Robeson, the designer, did a fantastic job. Other books that some of you may have are the one on Mrs. Thorne and her miniature rooms that he did with Mrs. Kalmbach, and also the Potter Palmer book that there is, that he did a great big coffee table book on 999 East Lakeshore Drive, which some of you may have seen at different places. So that's all good. Now, a very quick thumbnail history of historic districts and landmarks. The concept, the National Register for Historic Districts, places with creating these districts was dates from 1966 legislation and it was assigned by Congress to the Department of Interior's National Park Service. It was a reaction against really the urban renewal movement of the 1950s that just went through kind of like the Grim Reaper and took out lots of central city areas, and also particularly the teardown of Penn Station in New York City in 1963. I happened to be a little intern, a college intern, that spring in New York. Remember this well. To be listed, a house needs to be 50 years old in its present condition. That doesn't mean necessarily original condition, but present condition. So in Lake Forest, this all was led out of discussion, led to the Lake Forest Historic District, which was basically the Market Square area plus the East Side Estate District, gerrymandering around some of the support community neighborhoods. Market Square certainly was a major part of it. This was nominated in a very academic nomination form in 1975, and then in 1978 it actually was formally listed. It was all based on the 1857 curved linear street plan of Elmer and Hotchkiss. Now, 1972, though, already the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Historical Society, the predecessor of this organization, had been founded in the fall, and it had an historic sites committee organized pretty quickly after that began trying to record and document places. And by 1976, this led to the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, launched with an advocacy focus. So, given this historic sites and preservation accomplishments since late 1972, we are celebrating a half century of accomplishment, knowledge about, on the one hand, for the History Center, and stewardship of, on the other hand, for the Preservation Foundation. We are partners in increasing the number of historic sites and that these are well preserved. And Lori Steins and her collections have been essential to that partnership. So the maps, here are the wonderful maps that we're talking about. The East Side District the original Lake Forest District is in 4 sections. Downtown around Market Square. Then there are three, and that's the top part of the little green part there. Then there are 3 districts. The central one, which is a route that goes east along Westminster from the train station and back along on Deer Path, and that's Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the Lake Road District up above. Chapter 4 is the sort of chopped up district that's to the south. A lot of it was worked around some of the Lake Forest College campus and some of the non-estate neighborhoods. Now, the later districts, these included a 1980 Vine Oakwood Green Bay district that was built to deter teardowns to single-family historic residences in a village setting in favor of condo buildings. 1995 Green Bay Road Historic District was a huge project to deter new subdivision of larger historic properties. Those 3 were all grandfathered into the 1998 Ordinance for Historic Preservation of the City of Lake Forest, creating a Historic Preservation Commission that also had the authority to set up local districts and landmarks, and we're going to see some of those on the west side. Then in 2006, the Deer Path Hill Estates were set up for the neighborhood that's near the corner of Waukegan Road and Deer Path. And then West Park Historic District, the best surviving support neighborhood along the north shoreline light rail line. And this was designed, the north part of that, the most of it, was designed as a subdivision by Howard Van Doren Shaw in 1906 with lots for the Young Men's Club, local middle-class people. This is only on the National Register, and as is Deer Path Hills Estates. There's the map. It shows you some of those districts close to the red line there, and then the whole west side is a different area. So Chapter 1, downtown, in the middle of that district, between the Little Village neighborhood and the downtown, there is the Deer Path Inn, which has been for quite a while a national landmark. And we see here that this was built in 1928 by William C. Jones, and it was rehabbed by Anderson after a fire in 1938 and rehabbed again in 2016. But it is based on a 16th century Chiddingstone old manor, Kent, shown here. Look at the similarities. See? It's right halfway between London and Hastings on the coast. This is Chaucer country. This is like the Canterbury Tales, and we have it right here in Lake Forest. Between the two parts of that Lake Forest district is the 1900 Chicago Northwestern Railway Station, now the Metro Station, by Frost and Granger Architects, 1900. And it was the city rehabbed it from 2011 to 2018 under the leadership of Gunny Harbaugh with federal and Metro funding. That was some Obama shovel-ready money sort of thing. You can see it's open here, greeting all the people from the east side who are commuters coming in. Now here's a view through the shelter across. The picture is taken on the east side of the tracks, looking west through the train shelter toward Market Square. And it shows how the station is really the link between the east and the west side. Market Square was designed in 1916 by Howard Van Doren Shaw. He was the first Midwestern AIA gold medalist architect. The earlier ones were from London, Paris, and the East Coast. So the first Midwestern one was Shaw. This is one of Alice Moulton Neely's sketches from 1982, and it shows the condition before the more recent redoing of the landscape. So it shows the original intent kind of Howard Shaw, that the bushy parts of the tree would be above the second story from the park. Those were elms, and they all died, and that's why they're not there now. Now, the backers for this, one of them was Cyrus McCormick Jr. He had an 1890s Walden estate in southwest Lake Forest, the southwest corner of Lake Forest, actually, at that time, part of the 1857 plan. And he was one of the leading organizers of the Lake Forest Improvement Trust, 1913. Investors, not donors, but investors in Market Square before income tax deductions. Can you imagine life before income tax deduction? And for real estate or for donations. And that it was based on the idea that it would have a 4% return. The Long Park was instituted as the third plan to be able to have front footage for all those storefronts all the way around the park. Now, the developer brains were Chicago developer Arthur Aldous, but it was really Shaw who thought it up and carried it through, and lots of people helped him do it. He had a good team, but it was a Shaw project. Now, the cover from the book just shows this illustration, which we really liked. This is a Stuart period, pre-Georgian English tower in the mode of Christopher Wren, and also in colonial America from that period. The long north building, notice that long north building. It's English traditional Tudor style, but varied facade segments to suggest several buildings. It's got half timbering, you've got stucco, gable ends, step gables there along the way, versus one long undifferentiated building. And this is what our template is for Lake Forest. Another building that's a template, and referring back to that in the same mode of English Renaissance as that tower, is the First National Bank, 1930, and since 1980, the Northern Trust. Anderson and Tickner. Anderson had worked with Shaw from 1920 to 1925. And it's Georgian and colonial revival styles with classic elements. The pediment at the entry, the gambrel roof, which comes from the 1893 World's Fair, Massachusetts building, circular windows as at the Independence Hall, Philadelphia, etc., etc. And it's the character of the North Tower repeated here, carrying across the business district. Now, in the little village section to the south of that, charming little village that was rescued as condominiums were creeping along toward Vine Avenue. This is a 1910 house, an English Tudor cottage by Hugh M.G. Garden at 185 East Vine Avenue. And the landscape is by Jens Jensen. And I think in town it's maybe one of the best preserved of the Jens Jensen landscapes. His landscapes always look natural, and so they're always uprooted because they look like they just happen naturally, and there must be something wrong with them. This is across the street at 210 East Vine Avenue, 1899, and the house is kind of a Queen Anne simple cottage, but it's got a charming fence in front of it now and garden, nice villagey style gardens. It's really an asset. And this interesting building at the other end of Vine Avenue was built in 1929. This is the first house we're going to see that would belong to Lolita Sheldon Armour, Mrs. J. Ogden Armour. And this was at the nadir of her period of time. In 1929, it was built. She lived there from 1930 to 35. But at that point, she had used up her personal fortune and had sold Melody Farm to pay off her husband's debts to Armour and Company. She had basically put herself out of business, and this house was built for her by her husband's first cousin, Lawrence Armour, on property contiguous with his, so that she'd have a place to lay down at night. She was basically without resources at that point. Chapter 2, so this is part of a soap opera. I'm going to show you more houses of hers. Chapter 2 is that tour. The first time there was a tour done like this was for a 1982 book that had suburban tours, and this is a version of that. And you start off at the train station, move along Westminster toward the lake, then go along Lake Road in front of Forest Park, and then come back on Deer Path with a few detours, as you can see. This is what a lot of people use kind of when they're going to the beach from the train station too. So here is a very important house historically, but architecturally it's fascinating because it was an 1860 one-floor schoolhouse, and it was added onto in 1870 with a second floor, and it was moved here in about 1906 or 8 when a bigger house was built on its site over by Triangle Park. So it's a lovely Italianate, very livable-looking house. Now this is another 1870s Italianate house, and it shows a different approach for also an historic house. It's easy for me to tell historic houses, as we say, because I've lived in Lake Forest for 50 years. So if I don't remember it, it's different. Therefore, it's historic. So this is 360 East Westminster. It was originally the Pratt family house, Charles Pratt, I believe, and son of the original Pratt, who had another house. And it has been redone probably in the mid-20th century in an arts and crafts, stucco fashion, Queen Anne fashion. Very elegant redo. And both of these are historic, is the point. Now here's another original house, 611 East Westminster. Originally, this house was at 600 East Westminster, and it was moved around 1896-97 to build a big brick house on that 600 Westminster site. This house, history has been sorted out, that this was built by Eli Lake Canfield and his wife. He was a cousin of D.J. Lake, who had a house on Deer Path, and he had been promoting a hotel on the lake that had a problem. Its last dinner was served the night of the Chicago fire, and it went bankrupt. And it was later taken over by Lake Forest University and closed. Well, it actually burned down in 1877. But he was undaunted, and in 1873, as a real estate guy, published this map, the first blown-up scale map of Lake Forest ever, and it published in Chicago, and it was a big factor in bringing out a bunch of people from Chicago who had lost their homes in the fire, and had recouped enough of their resources that they could build new houses or buy new houses, and he repopulated Lake Forest, this map being part of it. So this is fascinating. The green spaces you'll recognize: Forest Park, the long strip, Ferry Hall is next to it, that's no longer there. Then the college campus, the north part of it was for the academy originally, and then you see the cemetery up at the top. Now, moving along Westminster, you would come to 941 East Westminster, built in 1889, close to the lake. It originally faced on Lake Road, but the front yard was subdivided off in the 1960s. And it was built by Burling & Whitehouse. Burling & Whitehouse did another important house called the Nickerson Mansion in Chicago, which is now the Driehaus Museum. Anybody here been to the Driehaus Museum? All right. So this is the same architects, folks. Now, David Adler came along in 1914, apparently, and put the stucco on this house. It was originally frame, and that's probably what saved it, because this is close to the lake. It probably never dries out in the summertime. And so having the stucco barrier probably has preserved it, along with good stewardship by the people who own it. Imagine having this big house with wood frame close to the lake. Now, rounding the corner, you come to the north part of Forest Park. This lawn originally wasn't perceived by people in town as a lawn. It had a bunch of tree stumps in it. And the original picnics, they were sitting on the tree stumps for the picnics. But it's been cleaned up various times, 1896 by O.C. Simons. And it was a golf course for a while, for the first golf course in town. And now it's been redone again in 2015. But you can see the lake over there through there, and it's got a forest edge. And this is still a stunning part of Lake Forest. This really defines our community. Just around the corner again on Deer Path, you go to 965 East Deer Path, Fairlawn Estate, 1923, replaced the 1870 Senator Charles B. Farwell house, which burned in 1920. And so his daughter, Grace Farwell Winston McGann, built this house with Delano and Aldrich, the top New York architects of the period. And so this is really a New York house in Chicago. It has a broken pediment like a James River mansion, but then it has lots of other Jeffersonian federal-style features to it. It's a marvelous house. A very important building is the 700 North Sheridan First Presbyterian Church, 1887. It was considered important at the time. By 1968, when people were coming out of the modernist period and rediscovering historic buildings, there was a book put out by Wayne Andrews that talked about Chicago regional and Midwestern architecture. And this is pictured in his book. So since 1968, this has been recognized as an historic, really historic building. The stones are from the Second Presbyterian Church in Chicago that had burned in 1871, carted out here by train, and used as the base for this building, this shingle-style, wonderful shingle-style building. Now, the person behind that, the brains behind that, was the Reverend Dr. James G.K. McClure, pastor of the Presbyterian Church from 1881, that's 6 years before the church was built, to 1905. He came from the East. He and his wife came from what you call established families, and he was not impressed with the little building that they were having church services in, where the wind in the wintertime whistled through the boards up into his gown that kind of ballooned up. So he had the church built. He was later acting president of Lake Forest University, 1892-93, then president of Lake Forest University, 1897 and 91, built a whole bunch of buildings. He was on the library board in town, 1898 to 99, when the library was launched in the new City Hall on the second floor. His partner in crime was Henry Calvin Durand, a wholesale grocer, and he was the Presbyterian Church's 1880s building committee chair, helped convince people to donate. He was the Lake Forest University board president when McClure built a whole slew of buildings, including 6 from 1899 to 1908, 5 of them extant, all by Frost and Granger. Moving along on Deer Path, then is 565 East Deer Path. Across the little bridge that was added in the 1980s is Thalfried, the 1909 house of Arthur and Anna Holt Wheeler. It's by Pond and Pond Architects. It looks like a nice country house, but if you look at it carefully, you'll notice it has these odd rectangular shapes in the front at the entrance and by the stairway. These shapes are references to a decade earlier secessionist hall building in Vienna, the Vienna secessionist movement of modern architecture, and it was picked up by Pond and Pond for this house. So this is a remarkable landmark. It was pointed out to me by people when I took them on a tour from the Society of Architectural Historians in 2008, and this lady said, "That's secessionist." And I said, "Huh?" So it's a really good house, and it's in great hands. It was rescued in the 1980s and has been preserved and fixed up ever since. Diana Millicar has worked on it. Now here's the building we all know. 509 East Deer Path, Church of Christ Scientist, 1948. History Center in Lake Forest, Lake Bluff in the 2010s. The original architect of the exterior was C.D. Faulkner, architect in Boston. The interior that we're more familiar with here is by Stanley Anderson, modified more recently by Peter Whitmer. Chapter 3, Lake Forest's North District. This is mainly characterized by Lake Road. We think of it there with its very shallow lots on the lakeside, with famous residences by Shaw, Adler, and Lindbergh. So we'll jump into those. Here we have an archetypical Shaw house, 999 North Lake Road, for Clayton Mark and his big family. This is still truncated. On the right, there was a living room wing that was taken off. I think they've replaced the dining room wing on the east side, and I think they have designs to do the west side also. But this was designed by Shaw's office in 1912, and the drawings were signed off on December 30th, and on January 1st, 1913, David Adler started his own practice with Henry Dangler. So it's likely that David Adler had a hand in this. And just to show you why, I think another reason why is down the street, 4 years later, is this villa. If you look at the hipped roof behind there, it's basically the same form, but it's got wings coming east off of that house. But it's a simple Shaw form. But it's a wonderful creative building. It was considered by Richard Guy Wilson in 2001 when he visited it as one of the most important Italianate houses in the United States. This at 1460 North Lake Road is a Harry T. Lindbergh house. Again, it's a long lateral house from 1930, but you'll see how differently Lindbergh handles that massing. Put forward is the central mass with wall gables instead of a full second story, and then it has stepped back for the extensions to the south and to the north. Here's another big house that we don't know as well as some. It's right across the street from David Adler's famous Edison Dick house of 1932, and this house is built for Harold Byron Smith, son of Edward Byron Smith, who founded Northern Trust in 1889. It's an immense house, beautiful Tudor house by Edwin Hill Clark, 2 years before he did Lake Forest Library. Here's the picture of his family. He's seated, and on the far left is his daughter Elizabeth Brown, married Gardner Brown, and I'll mention her again later. But you can see it was a nice family there. This is a picture. Here's little Harold when he was a kid, when this picture was taken in the 1870s. His father, Byron Laffin Smith, is on the far right in the back, and the founder in 1889 of Northern Trust. And he had an estate that went all the way to Sheridan Road from the lake. And here's his little mansion that he built. There wasn't room for it entirely, so that's where the street bowed out on Lake Road. So you're going along the straight street, and all of a sudden, bump, it goes to the left. And the bump is all that's left. The house disappeared in the 50s, and it's been subdivided and other houses were built. But this is Briar Lodge. That was his house. Now, I mentioned that house that was the Edison Dick house. This is the income, something magical happened to the income taxes about 1934, 35. They went from normal to 90% maximum rate income taxes. That meant that you had 10% to spend of your income. Houses got smaller, surprisingly enough, right after that. David Adler retired because he thought that the days were done. This is a wonderful Stanley Anderson house, somewhat in the same vein, different in its own way, not with a central drive, but with a loop drive around, and adapted to the new conditions. This was for the president of the John M. Smith Company. I think it was a son of Smythe, I can't remember how you pronounce it. Beautiful house, still beautifully tended, lovingly cared for. Now, Chapter 4, this is the sort of the South District, and it's divided by kind of the Lake Forest College campus in part there, and a torn-down development that was there too. So it's kind of two sections. But we'll see it. Mayflower Road, though, Lake Road was supposed to continue all the way south, but it didn't. It stopped at Forest Park. And so Mayflower is the lakefront street. This book doesn't show many of the lakefront mansions because you can't see them from the street. So it only shows places that you can see close to the roadways. Here's an archetypical it's an 1861 house by the first mayor, Harvey M. Thompson. This is irregular Andrew Jackson Downing Villa, very picturesque and more for an artistic type person. Notice the Chinese pagoda with the gold leaf on the roof on the north side. All the different angles and curves and bends and porches and things going on. But the nice modern porch gives you a good view of it even so. A little bit further south and across the street is what was built in 1880 is the President's House for Lake Forest University in this middle campus. It's on Sheridan Road 2. By the 1940s, it was called Patterson Lodge, and it was adaptively reused for admissions. Alice Moulton Neely did this drawing in 2003. But this is a Second Empire house built in the style of sort of coming off of what Napoleon III was doing on the Louvre with the mansard roofs and that sort of thing. So it became a very popular American style. And there was a beautiful one on the lakefront at Spring Lane and Lake Road that disappeared generations ago already. Now, Patterson Lodge, that was named for Robert W. Patterson, Second Presbyterian Church of Chicago, 1840s to the 1870s. He organized the Lake Forest Association in his church in 1856, and he was the first president then later of Lake Forest University after he retired from the church in 1875-77. He gave the dedication address 10 years later, 1887, when the Presbyterian Church opened that we saw, because it was the stones of his original church he'd built in 1842. So those were the spotted stones. So there's all kinds of turns about these different people who were involved as instigators in town. Here, a south entrance to the Lake Forest campus shows Blackstone and Harlan Halls, designed by Frost and Granger, 1907-1908. Behind, through the gate, you can see the 1878 Brown Hall behind, redone in 2021 by William Brown, the son of that Mrs. Elizabeth Smith. Lake Forest College, this is their middle campus, and this we're just seeing the things that you can see from the street. Going down Illinois Road in this district, you come to this nice late 20s house by Fraser and Raftery, very modern French house set into a ravine edge setting in the woods, and it's a very nice house to look at. Around the corner, we find a 1956 house, just 20 years later, really. 170 North Mayflower Road, Frank Lloyd Wright, built for Charles Glore Jr., son of a very prosperous stockbroker. And the materials and everything in this house are exquisite. The design is the most practical of Frank Lloyd Wright's typical houses in that period. You can actually avoid being swamped with water. It's a very practical house, and it had a wonderful borrowed landscape out across a big ravine. So it is one of the great Frank Lloyd Wright gems. Now, the fifth chapter here deals with an exemplary, larger support neighborhood. We saw the Oakwood Vine neighborhood, but this is a larger neighborhood. Kind of the bottom third is the Holt subdivision of 1895. As soon as there started to be the YMCA Club people building houses, they started having support community houses built in this little neighborhood. But north of that was all laid out by Howard Van Doren Shaw in 1906, with lots that were sold in 1907 only to members of the Young Men's Club. They were trying to build a middle-class presence in the town. By coincidence, this was the period when Eugene V. Debs was running for president on the socialist ticket, which Lake Foresters didn't vote here. They voted in the city. So they wanted some Midwestern, solid, middle-class people there, and they built this neighborhood. And they're all builder homes, or mostly builder homes. There are some architect homes, but mostly builder homes built in the 1910s. And the money came due in 1912 from the people who were the state owners who had sponsored it, and they used that money to buy the land for Market Square. So everything ties together in Lake Forest, Now, this is one of the 1890s, 1900 houses, the first group, down 771 North Summit. This was the house of a head gardener named Alex Binney, and he's shown here, bottom left, with the Lake Forest Horticultural Society on Lake Forest Day, 1908. Viles was the head estate gardener for the Viles estate. And does anybody know where the Viles estate was? We're sitting on it. The house was torn down, and then they built the church. So the barn is still back south a ways, and was adaptively reused as a house. And I think the main house may have been up higher where Mrs. Hamill's house was that was built in 1955. But I just thought you'd be interested to see that there was a head gardener here. Now, this is a little gem of a house on Westminster, built a little bit later, but it's arts and craftsman-style house, 112 East Westminster. For a while, the Griffiths lived in that. So the Atteridge family, Remember, the Atteridge family lived there. This had all been Atteridge Farm at one time or another, earlier, from after the 1830s. Most of us that have been around for a long time know it, though, as the Kreischer House. And Millicent Kreischer and her husband lived there, and their son, Gary Kreischer, who was a junior high, middle school principal here in Lake Forest. And this is a beautiful photograph by Marcus Norman of what's really a very nice house that has not been messed with, and it's something we should all be proud of. Another original house from this neighborhood, this is on Atteridge Road in the northeast corner of the development. This is one of two earliest houses that was built for Mrs. James Swanton. The Swantons were part of that early family that had come in the 1830s. And it's for a long time now been in two or three generations of the Julian family. But look at how nicely it is maintained. It's a four-square, which is an early federal style. There's a 1799 house in Fairmount Park, Philadelphia, that's in this style. It was done. So when you see this, think of early American roots of these kind of four-square houses. Another early kind of style is the 17th century New England style that you saw that was kind of medieval in character with an overhanging second floor. This is an architect-designed house, and it was Jerome Cerny whose signature was these bow windows, which is very uncolonial. But it's probably a Regency form that you'd see in Regency storefronts and that sort of thing. But he combined it very nicely in this house. This is you can see it's a nice spring picture with the flowering plants and things. But here's a wonderful success story. Many of us remember this house being kind of forlorn looking for a long time on Woodland Road, close to Green Bay Road. Fascinating gambrel roofed house. It turns out it was a kit home that they bought, kind of mail order, and it was shipped and then probably assembled by the Griffiths that were doing the building in the neighborhood. It was for the Fitzgerald family. It fell on kind of hard times, and it's recently been beautifully rehabilitated and expanded to the rear, not changing really the aspect of the streetscape. That's the kind of thing it's wonderful to see in this National Register district. Green Bay Road district, it's a long, stringy thing. It extends out toward the Skokie and even across the Skokie in a few places, but we're mostly covering what you can see going along Green Bay Road. The architects included are Shaw, Edward Bennett, David Adler, Harry T. Lindbergh, Anderson, Frazier, Ambrose Kramer, I.W. Coburn, and others. One of the earliest places, and I just point to it, on the left you can see that there's a little peak of a roof up there. That's this is a courtyard house, and on the other side of the courtyard is a mid-19th century brick Greek Revival house that I'm not sure about the date. Bricks probably arrived here by train after 1855 into the 1860s. That's where I would kind of place it. I don't picture poor farmers bringing in many bricks on their backs. But this was a barn. He had a few barns and outbuildings, and Shaw united them into one courtyard building, and it's been worked on several times by different architects since. But it's a wonderful building. It's the headquarters of the Ragdale Foundation, and Ragdale residents have been living here, although they're moving into a new house to the north of that, if not already soon. Here's Shaw in a plaque that was done around 1919 by his daughter, the sculptor Sylvia Shaw Judson, and it just, to remind us that Shaw was not chopped liver. Ragdale, this is not a Marcus Norman picture. I'm selfishly showing one of my own pictures of Ragdale, taken in 2016 for a 2018 book that appeared, Gardens of the Arts and Crafts Movement, author Judith B. Tankard. I took it about the same time of year, though, and the light was wonderful, and I was lucky. The book won an award over in England, and so this double-page spread, as it appeared in the book, makes people know about Lake Forest, even in Britain, so that's cool. This is an 1894 house by Henry Ives Cobb. He built himself a frame Queen Anne house where the Enwencia Club is or was, but he built a brick house for an important journalist who had the nice Second Empire house earlier over on Lake Road, and he left that house to come here. This important person was pioneer electronic journalist over the telegraph lines, William Henry Smith of the Associated Press. He was the collector for the Port of Chicago from 1877 to 81 under President Rutherford B. Hayes. the only sitting U.S. president to visit Lake Forest in 1879, staying in that now demolished house where the Crawford's house is. Hayes stayed with William Henry Smith in the former house there, and he was so this was a remarkable case. And this is a new house that he built to catch up with the latest style in 1894. Here's the Owensia Club as it was built in 1928. There was correspondence in the Griffith, Grant, and Lackey papers that showed that the Owensia Club was not being successful in getting fire insurance when they had all kinds of bachelors hanging out in the third floor rafters of this fire trap. And so they had to build a new building in 1927-28. And they did this wonderful French country chateau-style building that still is top-notch and very well maintained. A lot of the members of the club served in France during World War I in 1917-18. So a decade later, they loved this style, they'd seen it, and they wanted it here. Now, across the street, here's the second place that we're going to see of Mrs. J. Ogden Armour, 255 North Green Bay Road. And if you look at it, the roof again, it's another Shaw roof pattern, or the same repeating that form, but on a bigger, grander style. Most Adler houses tried to be more self-effacing or not to be so noticeable, especially in a period when everybody else was paying 90% income taxes. But she wanted to say she was back right across the street from the Owensia Club, and so she did. She'd lost all of her money, and now she got it back because they found that she had stock in the Universal Oil Company that had the patent for special super gasoline, and so she was rich again, as were her nephews, Philip Armour and Lester Armour, and they also built fancy houses. Here's the deer showing a picture of her at that period. And so she lived also at another house we're going to see. But this is the ups and downs of the Armours. And she died in that house. Here is 60 Northwestern Avenue. This was a gardener's cottage because Western was the service route for Green Bay Road. And there was a big house by Ambrose Kramer built for the Coleman family on Green Bay Road, still there, but as kind of a step-down house, the Colemans in the second generation had this little gardener's cottage remodeled in kind of a postmodern style, and there's a wonderful postmodern garden behind that wall, but you get the general asymmetrical kind of feel for this house that is essentially postmodern. I.W. Colburn was a great architect. Now, Chapter 7. This is the rangy west side. Much has been built there in the last 50 years. West of the Skokie River is basically what we're covering here, and it includes National Register landmarks and lots of, and also local houses and districts, landmarks and districts, and so we'll just get into it. Along Ahwahnee Road, this is built by Lewis Swift for his daughter Bessie Fernald, 1907, by Howard Van Doren Shaw. It was soon rented in 1909 by Sissy Patterson, a.k.a. the Countess Gesicki, who had led a rather soap opera-y life in Lake Forest for a few years. But it's a famous house, and it's a beautiful house. It shows up in Stuart Cohen's book on Shaw houses. This is a Fraser and Raftery house at the northwest corner of the golf course. The Shaw house was right across the street from the golf course. This is on the northwest corner of the golf course, and there were two sisters that lived next door to each other, married to two brothers, the Wellses, and they had similar but different houses by different architects. And this one is in beautiful shape and represents the district pretty well. Across to what was at that time a creek in 1903, across the creek to the west, now Route 41 and countless railroad tracks, this house was built for Frank Hibbard by his childhood friend George Lyon Harvey. They grew up across the street from each other on Prairie Avenue. 1903, this was the heart of the Owensia hunt, fox hunting country, riding to the hounds, that sort of thing. And so they built this large mission-style house right here. It was originally on 30 acres. It's now on a few acres, but it's a beautifully preserved, wonderful, entertaining house. This was Mrs. Armour's first house in Lake Forest, 1500 West Kennedy Road, Melody Farm, 1908 to 1910. It got completed. The architect was Arthur Hoyne. The interior was one of the early signature jobs of Elsie de Wolfe, the first major 20th century designer. And by 1948, it was Lake Forest Academy's Reed Hall. This is a landmark. Process was gone through by the Academy for the property. Now, this picture comes from the Academy's archives. I think the picture was taken by our Mrs. J. Ogden Armour of a wedding party, a pre-wedding party. Her husband, J. Ogden, is seated there. You see in 1921 at Melody Farm on the, I think, west porch. His daughter is right next to him, and probably her fiancé is then next to her, and then parts of the wedding party were there also. This was the happy time before he started to lose his shirt. He's reputed to have lost $1 million a day for 250 days. Even for most of us going through the last year, that's kind of breathtaking. Now, this is 570 Hathaway Circle, 1925, with architect Ralph Varney, architect, and it's on the national. It was there. This building is a National Registered Landmark, but later was made a local district, Meadowood Farm District. This was the Leonard Farm, and it was a little farm group that was built. He never built the main house, and it was eventually absorbed by the estate to the north. But this building reminds me tremendously of one that many of you will remember from visits to France. This is Northern French Norman style, but it reminds me of Marie Antoinette's farm group at Versailles from the 1770s and 80s. And it's not the same, but it's got some similarities that makes you think that Varney had visited there, and maybe Mr. Leonard had as well. So we have all kinds of interesting influences here in town. Here in the same vein is a French Norman-style house, half-timbered, 971 Verdal Lane, built in 1929 by Stanley D. Anderson, designed by Anderson, as he had designed the whole Deer Path Hill Estates district neighborhood as a garden suburb. He built that, and they built lots of houses in the area, and he supervised all of them. He represented the developer for supervising all the building of these places. He built this one, liked it a lot, and when it went toes up by 1931, it was given to him in lieu of payment for all the work he'd done. So he got his house, and he lived there. It's now under the stewardship of our past president, Jim Upsitnik, beautifully cared for again, and lots of restored even the storm windows on the place. So that's a great place. Anderson, here we see Anderson. He was a Lake Forest College alum, 1916, attended the University of Illinois in architecture, also at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and then the University of Pennsylvania. From 1920 to 25, he was an associate of Shaw's, but he had been during the war over there. 1917-18, he was the driver for General Pershing. At Lake Forest College, the president was a Germanophile, and everybody had to study German. So Anderson could speak German. So they had him be the driver for Pershing, because if they ended up on the wrong side of the battle lines, he could always talk his way out of it for Pershing, and he wouldn't get taken prisoner. And this is a very different-looking house, 1301 Knollwood Circle, built in 1931 by Zimmerman Saxon Zimmerman. It was a personal country club, even though it said the Knollwood Club. The top floor was a bunkhouse for his golf buddies, Colonel Morris's golf buddies, with a typical roof garden of the period. The basement was a locker room and rumpus room, and I think probably some alcohol drifted down that way. Upstairs, there was a beautiful men's bar in a men's dressing room, so that it wouldn't offend the ladies during Prohibition. So this is a fabulous house. In about 2000, there was a column in Chicago Magazine that listed this among the 30 most important Chicago area houses. This is a wonderful change of pace. This is, in the background, you see the long Georgian-style stable block of Ellowa Farm, owned now by the city of Lake Forest. It's been rehabilitated. It was built in 1915-17 by Alfred Hopkins for A. Watson Armour and his wife Elsa, hence Ellowa Farm. The original landscape was by Ralph Rodney Root, landscape architect. But this wonderful English flower garden here is more recent. It's probably the Lake Forest Garden Club or members, that sort of thing. They've been working on that. So that's a great picture by Marcus. Now, that's A. Watson Armour on the left. With the Osborne family, his daughter, who was married to a chairman of Pullman, I believe. And the two little girls, Karen McGovern is on the left, the taller of the two. And Gwen Lincoln is on the right. The late Gwen Lincoln is on the right. So these are long-term friends of the Preservation Foundation, and it shows the continuity of things over time. Now, the southwest part of that is definitely GPS country. Finding these places can be a little bit distracting, but certainly the stellar one here is 810 South Ridge Road, 1925, by Howard Van Doren Shaw. It was called Westfield Farm. Landscape was by 100 Acres, was by Jens Jensen, and maybe these are remnants of some of his naturalistic plantings there also. And the owner of the place was steel magnate Robert T. Lamont, also Secretary of Commerce, 1929 to 33, under Herbert Hoover. Not a great period for many investors. By coincidence, though, Lake Forest Post Office was built in 1932-33 during the Hoover administration. What a coincidence. Now, a local district is the Grove School campus, owned by the city itself, 100 East Old Mill Road, Ridge Farm Preventorium in the 1930s, before antibiotics, to help city kids get away and get fresh air who were threatened by TB. They could come out here, and there were going to be places where they could be outdoors and not be subject to just the fumes of the city. This was the dining hall, Dickinson Hall, and it's now the senior center. The people who do the landscaping there have kind of missed the boat. They've blocked part of the view by putting trees in front of it. They could put trees on either side, but they shouldn't put trees right in front of it anymore. But, it takes a while. But I think if they happen to be chopped down, you'll know who to blame. This is my last house. This is 1711 Devonshire Lane in the southwest corner of Lake Forest, the far edge of the Lasker Estate property, built in 1948. Lasker moved to New York in the late 30s, gave the property to the University of Chicago, which didn't exactly know what to do with it, and they sold it off in chunks gradually. This was part of a larger chunk, but it's now still 2.5 acres. Architects Keck and Keck. We're looking at the north side of the house. There's nothing there to let the wind into the house, if you see. It's very cleverly planned. The other side is all windows, and with a big overhead, so only winter sun can get in. Summer sun can't get in because of the big overhangs. So this was a brilliantly designed building to be cool in the summer, warmer in the winter. It was cleverly done. It just went onto the National Register in 2021. It was rescued, and Jim Ipsitnik will second me on this. It was rescued by Christopher Enck, who took it on even though it was not a financially viable idea in the late 2010s. By 2020-21, when he sold it, however, real estate values had reversed, and I think it saved his bacon. But it's a wonderful thing that he did, saving this. Christopher Enck, if you're ever looking for somebody to work on a house, remember his name. He was very good. So, in sum, this is a survey that has shown almost 20% of the 261 sites covered in Architectural Lake Forest. They represent a full range of building and landscape scales and types from the 1850s through the 1960s up to and about a half century ago from all over town. And a few clients have been thrown in just to show the care of the community in the stewardship over the years of building well and taking care of things. Thanks again to the project team, to the donors, to Lori Baker, and to her team, Marcy Kerr, who made this possible, President Susie Astenson, where's Susie? Right here, who said, we want this project to get done. You always need someone that says that. With thanks to the hundreds of generous donations from 5 figures down to the much smaller ones in the LFPF annual fund, this project was made possible. Thank you all. Thank you for coming to Red.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation, Art. And a special thanks to Marcy Kerr, Executive Director at Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, for making all of this possible. And a special thanks to the sponsor of this program, Baker McNicholas Real Estate Group. So big thanks to them.